All right. Good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome to PNP Live. My name is Keith. I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose. I just want to thank you all for joining us here to celebrate the release of Joshua Henkin's new novel, Morningside Heights. At any time during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase copies of tonight's book on PNP's website. Your purchases will come to the store at a difficult time for small businesses across the country. In addition to growing your own library, a book sale from Politics and Prose means that we at the store are able to keep bringing you content like this, which we are so proud of. You can ask the author a question by submitting it in the Q&A box, the button for which can be found near the bottom of your screen. Be sure to submit it in the Q&A and not in the chat so that the author can see it. So I'll waste no more time getting to the main event. I'm so pleased to welcome Joshua Henkin to our event tonight for his long-awaited new novel, Morningside Heights. Josh is the MFA director at Brooklyn College. Originally scheduled to publish a year ago, this novel is an intimate and tender story about the marriage of Pru and Spence. He is the brilliant MacArthur genius-winning Shakespeare professor at Columbia, and she is the former student who fell for her teacher, but now later in life, they face the heartbreaking toil of Spence's early onset Alzheimer's. Told primarily from the view of the wife Prue, who must make the painful transition of moving on from someone who still is there physically, and from the estranged son from the first failed marriage. This novel is full of well-rounded, sympathetic, and often funny characters navigating through tragic circumstances together. It's received tremendous reviews, as well as the #1 pick for the Indie's Next June newsletter. Josh will be joined in conversation tonight by Marisa Silver, award-winning author of numerous novels and short story collections, most recently The Mysteries, which came out last month. So please join me in welcoming Josh Henkin and Marisa Silver.
Thank you. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Marisa, so nice to be here, and thank you, Keith, for that lovely introduction. Hey, Marisa, you ready to go?
I am ready to go. Will you start by reading for us a little bit?
I will. I'm going to read basically a short section and then an even shorter, like one paragraph.
Okay.
And so I'm going to read first from when Pru and Spence meet. Spence is her Shakespeare professor at Columbia. She is a PhD student. And this is from when they meet to the very beginning of the book. Her first day of class, she looked up from her seminar table and saw Spence Robin, her Shakespeare professor, enter the room. He was only 6 years older than she was, but he was the professor, Columbia's rising star. So when she passed him on a snowy afternoon outside chock full of nuts, she glanced away. "Are you pretending to be shy, Miss Steiner?" That was how he addressed the class. Miss Steiner, Mr. Jones, Mr. Thompson, Miss Dunleavy, doing it with an edge of humor, as if it were a mild joke. We do spend most of our day outside the classroom. It's not like we just materialize in Philosophy Hall. A gale blew past them, and Spence's jacket collar flipped up to his ears. His shock of auburn hair was covered in snow, and Prue was tempted to offer him her hat. But her hat was pink, and if she gave it to him, then she would get covered in the snow, and she knew he wouldn't countenance that. They seated themselves in chock full of nuts. "The coffee's terrible here," Spence said. Prue agreed, though she was inured to terrible coffee. She drank terrible coffee most days, often from chock full of nuts. Spence removed a packet of peanuts. It was an old habit, he explained, a product of his fast metabolism. He'd been so thin as a boy, he'd been sent to summer camp by the Fresh Air Fund, and when he failed to gain more than a few pounds, he got to stay for an extra 2 weeks. The snow was falling harder now. At this rate, they'd be skiing home. Prue said, "Are we going to talk about Coriolanus?" "Do you want to talk about Coriolanus?" "As long as you don't make me recite." It was what Spence did in class, saying that word recite with the same little ironical smile he wore when he called her Miss Steiner. "How about you tell me where you're from?" Under the influence of the coffee, and urged on by the wind coming through the open door, Prue started to loosen. She was from the suburbs of Columbus, she said. "Sounds like a tautology to me." She surprised herself by saying, "You little snob." Little? It was true, he must have been 6 feet tall. "And what's in the suburbs of Columbus?" "Oh, just a bunch of complicated Jewish families like mine." Another tautology? "So you know about complicated Jewish families?" "I come from one." This surprised her. With his rangy, slender frame, his pale face and thatch of red hair, he put her in mind of the Irish countryside. And Spence, she thought of Spencer Tracy, not to mention his last name, Robin. Well, you could have fooled her. My Christian name is Shulam, he said. That doesn't sound very Christian to me. In kindergarten, he said, he changed his name to Spence. At 5, he became an Anglo-Saxon. At 6, a Francophile. It's the old immigrant story. I was trying to escape the Lower East Side. Well, you've done a good job. He was the youngest tenured member of the English department, the author at 30 of an award-winning book, a guest on PBS with Bill Moyers. You're not still religious, are you? He laughed. His paternal grandfather had been a rabbi in Lithuania, but his parents' God had been communism. He hadn't even been bar mitzvahed. One Yom Kippur, he'd gone to the Museum of Natural History to stare up at the great blue whale. She told him about growing up Orthodox in the Midwest, how she'd moved to New York to become an actor. So here I am, she said, as if everything she'd done, leaving Columbus, going to Yale, moving to New York to do theater, was in order to be seated where she was now, having coffee with Spence Robin. I could never be an actor, he said. I don't like to perform. That's not what I heard. His lectures were said to be packed to the rafters. People were up in the nosebleed seats. Acting is different, he said. I'm a shy man. Yet here he was talking to her, talking to this stranger. But then he stopped talking and she became shy herself. The snow had tapered off, and with the weather no longer keeping them indoors, she thought she should make her getaway. She got up and he followed her. That's me, he said in front of her building. And that's me. Spence pointed up to Claremont Avenue. If I work on my arm, I could throw snowballs at your balcony. I'd like that. And then, feeling foolish, she wanted him to throw snowballs at her balcony. She rushed inside. Okay, and then I'm just going to read one more paragraph, give you a little background. So Spence was actually married before he met Pru briefly, kind of a disastrous marriage, and he had a son from that marriage, and he and that wife split up when they were 8 months old, when the son was 8 months old, and that son is raised by his mother, who's a hippie, and she wants to poop in all 50 states, and so she carries her son Arlo with her, and he follows her around. But for 2 brief years, when he's a teenager, he lives with Pru and Spence and with his half-sister Sarah, and it's kind of a disastrous 2 years because Spence is very intelligent in a traditional way, and Arlo is very intelligent in an untraditional way. Arlo's dyslexic, and they butt heads. And at some point when Arlo is living with them, his father gets him a job at an independent bookstore, and Arlo, one of his jobs is to shelve the books, and he starts to make what could be called mistakes, shelving the books, or could be called acts of sabotage, depending on how you look at them. And I'm just going to read one paragraph of Arlo working at an independent bookstore. And in large part, because I also want to give a shout out to Politics and Prose and to independent bookstores around the country for the great work they do. So here's the paragraph I'm talking about. Over the next 2 weeks, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own was found in home furnishing. Graham Greene's The Quiet American in Spirituality and Meditation. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird in Nature. Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer in Science and Medicine. And William Burroughs' Naked Lunch in cookbooks. What's a farewell to arms doing in military history, someone said. Soon there are more sightings. Jean Reese's Wide Sargasso Sea in marine biology, William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying in Death and Mourning, John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany in Religion and Spirituality, and George Orwell's Animal Farm in Gardening. Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited wasn't with the books at all, but was shelved instead with the bridal magazines. Okay, so I'll stop the reading there.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to, before I launch in to talk about this amazing book, I just want people who are listening, please put your questions in the Q&A and just, you can write them down as we go, just so you don't forget them, and we'll get to them towards the end of the conversation. But don't be shy, and please, put them there so I can find them. I'm going to ask at first a question that is kind of embarrassing to ask, but of course, I think everyone wants to know, which is what was the inciting germ for this book? I mean, I know as a writer and as a reader that books go in so many directions, but you sort of wonder, what was that kernel? What was the first thought that you thought, this is a world I want to explore?
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, this might be at least narrowly so, my most autobiographical book to date. My father was a big professor at Columbia. He taught at the Columbia Law School for 50 years, and he developed Alzheimer's much later than Spence, in his late 80s, but there's never a good time to get it. And he was still teaching. He was teaching past when he should have been. And when he was in decline, my mother started to take a class at the Jewish Community Center in Manhattan for caregivers. And my mother is very much not a consorting with strangers kind of person. And I was interested in what it had become like for her to be in a position where she was really interested in talking to other people whom she had nothing in common with, aside from the fact that they were all caregivers. And so the book started out as a very long, short story that kind of took place entirely at the JCC. And then, by the 8th draft, the JCC was gone. And I realized I was writing a novel about a family.
Well, it is a novel about a family, and it's also a novel in a lot of ways about time. And I think time is sort of one of fiction's great subjects. It's maybe a subject that fiction handles better than any other art form. And one of the really extraordinary challenges and achievements of this book for me, and I think for the readers who will read it, is the way that you manage to convey a lifetime in 250 pages, 280 pages. So much is left out, and yet we have a sense when we read the book that we've not only lived the life of these people in this particular circumstance that they're in, where this Alzheimer's is diagnosed, and then the ultimate unraveling of Spence's life, but also we have a sense of the arc of a marriage. And I just wondered how you thought about that in terms of the structure of the novel. I mean, obviously there's great swaths of information that are left out. You can't contain every moment in a novel, and yet we do have a sense of the sweep of it. I mean, it has an epic kind of quality in the sweep of time. And I wondered whether that was something that how you managed it, if it's something that you came to early on, that you were going to take that much of a view.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and Marisa, and I guess I feel like I can answer that in two ways. Like one in a more writerly way, which I'll do second, and then in a less writerly way first. So the less writerly answer is that I wasn't really interested in writing a book about Alzheimer's, and I don't really think it is a book about Alzheimer's, despite the fact that that's obviously how it gets described. I think you're right. I think it's a book about a long marriage, and although Alzheimer's is what sets the book in motion, it's really about, we start with Pru's childhood, and it covers a lot of time. And so it's a book about a marriage and a family. And I wrote 3,000 pages, and I found the book in there. I wrote it over 7-8
You said 3,000 pages?
Yeah, that's how I write in general. I write so many pages. So, now I get to the more writerly part of things. I'll sometimes tell my graduate students that, I don't think they know their characters well enough. And I'll ask them a series of questions about their characters. And if they're particularly defensive, as occasionally they are, they'll say, well, I don't know why that has to be in the story. And I'll say, it doesn't have to be in the story. You just need to know it. And that knowledge will, we'll get into the story in some sort of way. It's like Hemingway's metaphor, the tip of the iceberg, is that if you really know your characters, the tip of the iceberg implies the whole iceberg. And if you don't know your characters, then all you have is the tip. So there's just a lot that got cut, just huge, huge amounts. And for me, revision is about compression and figuring out what's important and what's less important. And then the other thing I'd say, this is actually, now we get really writerly here, but I do want to say something about time in fiction. Because, one of the challenges of this book in particular is the character of Arlo, who in the early drafts wasn't even there. And at some point I said to myself, well, what if Spence had a previous marriage, and what if he had a son? And I thought, nah. But I tried it, and then the book really opened up. But Arlo is someone who appears and then disappears for long periods of time. And so how do you structure the book to be able to evoke both his presence and his absence? And the book covers many years, and it's not told chronologically exactly, or there are multiple narratives. And I was asked to blurb Joan Silber's, not her most recent novel, but her last novel, Improvement. And I keep meaning to thank Joan for this. And I'll be doing an event with her, so I will get a chance to thank her. I can't even say exactly what I'm thanking her for because I don't quite know. But there was something about the structure of that book that made me figure out the structure of this book. You know, how to organize the parts so that we got both the presence and absence. And Joan herself, I mean, there's a series of books put out by Grey Wolf on craft, and she wrote the book about time. You know, the art of time in fiction. It's a great, for the writers among you out there, even for the non-writers among you out there, if you want to think about time in fiction, which to me is the most interesting question, read that book, and then just read a lot of Alice Munro stories. I mean, Alice Munro, the person who does things with, I mean, she taught me that structure can be beautiful.
Yeah.
And people think, structure, I have to have a structure, but that's not true. Structure, if done well, can be beautiful.
Well, what's so thrilling about reading your book is that, as you say, we move ahead with events in the marriage and events surrounding the diagnosis, Spence's diagnosis, and then suddenly you'll start a new chapter and you'll be going back in time to gather up Arlo to see where he's at or what his childhood was like. And it's a huge testament to the book that even though the structure sort of zigzags and takes us in and out of time, we're compelled backwards and forwards, not only by the depth of our interest in these characters who are so richly drawn, but also by the small little mysteries that you plant for us, that you sort of leave us hanging. What will happen? And they're not, writ large. This is not a mystery novel or a whodunit, but it's the mystery of how will these people solve this relationship problem going forward? How will, that is, I found it very thrilling to move through this book and to be sort of brought back and forth in time, because there was never a moment where you felt like, I don't want to be with this person. I don't want to find out what's going to happen to them. Arlo is a fantastically conceived character. It's wonderful to think that you came to him later in the process. One of the, you read that wonderful passage from the bookstore, and one of the lines that I'm so moved by in this novel is when he gets the job at the bookstore that his father sort of sets up for him. And you write, his father had told him it was one of the best bookstores in the country, and what Arlo heard was that Arlo, was one of the best people in the country. I mean, that sort of sums up that relationship so gorgeously. And I think that Arlo allows us to know Spence in a way that, in a funny way, Pru doesn't allow us to know Spence. I think it's through that relationship with Arlo, which Spence expresses his love intellectually. And as you said, it's not a way that Arlo can receive it. He receives it only as criticism because he can't live up to the kind of intellectual rigor that his father demands of him. And it was sort of a brilliant inclusion of that character, because it allowed me to understand not only what's difficult about Spence, but what he regrets and what he understands is the loss in terms of that relationship because of his inability to really grasp how to love this particular child. It's easy for him to love his daughter, who's studious, intellectually driven. It's much harder for him to understand how to love Arlo. In the passage that you read at the beginning, something that came across that is really a large part of this book is the Jewish life of these characters. And what I loved in this book was how you captured that kind of somewhat assimilated Judaism that we recognize so much, especially in the Upper West Side of New York, but also how you captured the way, especially for Pru, she has both moved away from and then comes back towards a sense of faith or spirituality or an understanding of what is useful in that experience. And it's not really a question, but I do want to talk about the way in which you create the Jewish life of this family. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do feel I feel like it's a really important part of the book, even though it doesn't take up that much real estate if you sort of look at sort of the passages that focus on it. But I do feel like it hovers over the book. It's kind of a present absence, I guess is what I'd call it. I actually grew up, that passage talks about tautologies. I myself grew up in a complicated Jewish home. My father was the son of a well-known Orthodox rabbi. My grandfather lived in the Lower East Side for 50 years and never learned English. He just lived Yiddish. And my father, although he was very much part of the secular world, remained Orthodox till the day he died. My mother was much more secular, and so I grew up with this mixture of things. But I went to a Jewish day school from K to 12, so I'm both like well aware of and immersed in that Upper West Side secular Jewish world, but I'm also aware of and immersed in a much more traditional Jewish world. So in other words, I have parts of Spence and parts of Pru in me. And I guess, yeah, I was interested in the ways, Pru, when she, as you said, Marisa, when she meets Spence, she basically eventually, she leaves religion. And, her daughter, Sarah, gets bat mitzvahed, but goes to Hebrew school in order to be bat mitzvahed, but doesn't have much of a Jewish education. Late in the book, Sarah says to Pru, I wish you'd sent me to Jewish day school. At least you had a choice. I wasn't given a choice. And I did an interview with the Jewish Book Council, and the interviewer said to me, you're trying to make a statement about people being robbed of a Jewish education. I said, first of all, novels don't make statements. Novels tell stories and they put characters out in the world. But I said to the interviewer that for every person like Sarah, there's a person like my classmates at Jewish day school, a school called Ramaz on the Upper East Side, who resent their parents for shoving it down their throat. So I think we all kind of want what we didn't have. But I am interested, Marisa, in the ways in which I think for a lot of people who are either secular Jews or maybe secular people in general, or people, maybe even more so, people who are brought up more traditionally and then become more secular as adults, how they sometimes try to go back. I mean, Pru tries to go back and she goes to say a prayer for Spence. And she does it, but she can't quite, it doesn't work exactly. I don't mean it doesn't make it better, that too. But I mean that.
It doesn't work for her.
Yeah, it doesn't work for her. That I think that, and I do think that there's a feeling that I know a lot of people have of yearning for a kind of spirituality that doesn't entirely make them comfortable, that they don't have access to, an envy of a believing life that they are no longer, or maybe never were, capable of.
Especially when they confront these sort of unanswerable moments in their lives, like illness, like death. You sort of are yearning, right? You're reaching for something. I think what I loved so much about the way you handled it, and you're right in saying it doesn't occupy that much space in the pages, but it's part of the texture of these people's lives. And I think one of the things that's so marvelous about this book is that you create these fully textured lives without having to sort of, I don't know, reductively decide that, this is the topic. It's about Judaism or it's about Alzheimer's. It's just that all of this stuff is utterly braided together. And that's what makes this marriage and this family kind of pop off the page. Something I really felt about the issue of religion was that it really tied into the kind of overall theme of loss in the book, which is so beautifully woven in so many ways. We talked about Arlo and his loss of a kind of father that he needs. There's obviously the loss of memory, and it's very heartbreaking to watch, not only as Spence begins to gather what's going on for him, but as the people around him begin to sort of accept what it is. There's also a loss of identity. I mean, Pru is such a fascinating character because she really does relinquish her ambition to be the wife of a great man. So I'd love to talk a little bit about Pru and talk about how you figured her in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, as you know yourself from your own work, it's so hard to remember how you
Yeah.
But I definitely started with Pru. I think it was Garcia Marquez who said that, once he has the first paragraph of something, everything else follows. And so he finds the novel 12 times easier than a collection of stories because he needs 12 first paragraphs for a collection of stories. I mean, he's sort of being facetious, but I think it's true. And I mean, I think, I don't know how I exactly came up with it, but the opening line of the book, I think, kind of is the whole book incubating. Growing up in Bexley in the suburbs of Columbus, Prue had been drawn to the older boys, thinking they could take her far from home. And, she dates a series of older men, and though Spence himself is only 6 years older than she is, he's much more established than she is when they meet. He's an old soul. And I think incubating in that line is the idea of a really smart, accomplished woman who, for whatever reason, the era, just who she is, circumstance, I mean, who knows why people are the way they are, but for whatever reason, ends up really sort of, as you said, relinquishing her own ambitions and, hitching her star to this big professor. And so, to me, I wasn't really interested in writing about, I wanted to write about his Alzheimer's, but we are in his point of view, but I don't believe we're ever in his point of view while he's in decline. I tell my grad students, you shouldn't write a story about a ball rolling down a hill, because what's going to happen is the ball is going to roll down the hill. I'm obviously talking metaphorically, but that's kind of, if you're going to write realist fiction, it's not speculative and it's taking place now, unfortunately, there isn't much tension in what's going to happen with the disease. We know where it's going. But what is interesting is how the people who surround the person with the disease, how they deal with it and how they don't deal with it. And I thought, what does it mean for Prue? And Prue is someone for whom, I think Spence's success is more important to Prue in a certain way than it is to Spence. I'm sure he wants to be accomplished, but he's embarrassed by his success. She's proud of it. She throws him the MacArthur party, and he's kind of disgruntled. Why'd you do that? I'm embarrassed. Why are you showing me off? And I think that that's because, in some way, yes, she really takes on his success as her own. And then, when his brain fails him, she has to reinvent herself. In some ways, it's harder for her than it is for him. And so, yes, she is the most interesting character to me in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a story about how the loss that she experiences in all sorts of ways, the religious loss, the loss of her husband, gradually forces her to sort of finally, after a life of not really asserting her identity, just figure out who she is and what she wants. And that is really the beauty of the story, is that it's about someone, and she might never have done it had it not been for this, which is, fate and randomness and all these things that the story sort of talks about inadvertently. It creates a life, and I thought it was beautifully accomplished. The other thing that, I just want to point out this one moment in a scene. You talked about your own father, teaching past his prime. And this is something that happens in the book as well. Stu sort of holds on to his lecturing long past when he is capable of doing it. And when he finally accepts that he has to stop after he's in the middle of a lecture, he just stops talking. And the students, of course, are radically uncomfortable, and it's an embarrassment for everyone. He finally accepts it. He says, "Something's wrong with me." This is what she'd wanted. This is about Prue, for him to stop pretending so she could stop pretending too. But now that he'd done it, she was stricken. And there's just such a beautiful, beautiful understanding of how she has held on to him. He has been her identity. And once he lets go of it, she's empty in a certain way. Not only, bereft at the recognition that he can't do what he did, but it goes deeper because of the way you've drawn her as someone who sort of created her identity through another person. And that person says, "I'm no longer capable. Who is she?" And so the great journey of this book is Prue figuring that out. It's very beautifully done. Another piece of the fabric that's woven into this book has to do with class, predominantly through the character of a caregiver that they hire named Ginny and her son Rafe. Is that character someone who came in early on, or was that a later addition? How did you configure her?
I knew Ginny would be in the book. pretty early on. I probably didn't, because I was reading 3,000 pages, I may not have actually gotten to her, but she wasn't a surprise to me in the way Arlo was a surprise. Yeah, I'm really interested in that relationship. And that too is really, Ginny's invented, but I witnessed and partook of that relationship. My mother was 15 years younger than my father, so she remained in good shape while he was declining. But she had a job and she had a life that was with him, but that was apart from him. And so he, in the last couple of years of his life, had full-time care. There was a night person and a day person, and then someone who worked on weekends as well. And I don't know, it's such a complicated relationship. The temptation is to think, oh, this person is part of our family. But she's not. It's an employer-employee relationship. There are issues of power and of class, and often, not always, but often of race. And Ginny is a single mother living in East New York who has a teenage son, whom she has some very clear ambitions for. He has clear ambitions for himself, and he's also hemophiliac. So there are complications going on in her own life. And Pru's a good liberal in a lot of ways, but when even good liberals can find themselves overstepping their bounds in certain situations. And so I was just interested in, when you're writing about a family, there's such history there. Whereas when Ginny shows up in the book, she moves from being an utter stranger to a real intimate very quickly. And that is a very complicated and unusual relationship. And she's not a member of the family. Like when Spence dies, she goes to get another job. In fact, I'm not going to ruin what happens in the book. But she is an employee. And I think there's a lot of guilt and a lot of things that are lying not so deep beneath the surface. And I guess the other thing I'd say that interests me about Ginny, and I don't think this actually made it, I'm pretty sure, into the final draft. I always forget what I cut and what I didn't cut. But even if this line didn't make it into the final draft, the spirit of it made it into the final draft, which is that in some version, there is a point when Spence calls out and Pru runs to the back of the apartment to see what's going on, to take care of him. And he says, no, I want Ginny. And to me, that's both heartbreaking and also, but something more complicated than that. Obviously, Pru and Spence know each other really well, and they've had a long and good marriage. And Spence obviously doesn't really prefer Ginny to Pru. But in those especially at the end, in that last year or so, there are ways in which Ginny knows Spence better than Pru does. She knows how he likes his grapefruit cut, and she knows like his body in a way that Pru doesn't. And I'm sure that's sort of devastating to Pru on one hand, and on the other hand, it's a kind of relief that it gives her her own independence. So to me, that relationship, so interesting and complicated, and does, as you say, Marisa, get into issues of class and race that are I think really important ones.
Yeah, and Pru, who is someone who I think we're very empathic with, she makes a lot of language errors with Ginny. She reveals her biases and her subtle form of classism, simply by offering to give Ginny things from her closet, or when they go to look at the campus of Columbia, and she reveals that her own daughter, although she could have gone there for free, chose a different school that they paid for, which is, for Ginny and her son, a kind of unbelievable choice, right? But Pru, she only gets it after the fact. And I think that the book so beautifully and delicately, I guess what I want to say about what's so great about this book is that there's like a lack of judgment on the writer's part, which is sometimes very rare, especially in this moment when we're all so worried about PC-ness and who the right attitudes and there's just such an admirable, the way in which you lay these characters out without judging them, just letting them be who they are, which I think makes them feel richer and more real than books where you have a sense that the author is being careful or being prejudging or having judgment about the negative aspects of a character. I mean, Spence is not a great guy in many ways. Pru makes mistakes in many ways. The relationship between Arlo and Sarah when they're young, Sarah's horrible to him. And the writing delivers that without judgment, and it allows I think, the reader to not judge in a funny way, to just see it as part of life. Was that something that's natural to you, or something that you caught yourself and had to draw back from? Where do you land with that as you write?
It's funny, I think I really agree that's very important to me in fiction, is that fiction is a mirror, not a judge. It's funny because I do think of myself as a pretty judgmental person, but I'm pretty good at sort of parking that judgment when I sit down to write. People will ask me, like, what does the book think about this character? Or what do you as the writer think about this? Or what's your opinion about that? And I'll always say, because it's true, is like, I have plenty of opinions as a human being, but as a novelist, I have no opinions. And I really feel that. I feel that it's not that that opinions aren't good, but that's just not what I do. I mean, philosophers can have opinions, rabbis, priests, parents, children, but I feel like writers, at least the kind of writing that I like to write, is about getting out of the way.
Yeah. Well, I think that when you get out of the way, also you allow your reader to invest in a way. They don't feel like they're being told to believe a certain thing about a certain character. And I think it makes your reader sit back and go, well, my knee-jerk judgment would be X, but let me look at this in a more complicated way, because the author is not telling me that I should feel X. So what is the author telling me?
Right. I think we in general don't like to be told what to think. And I feel like it's important to respect the reader's intelligence. Because, my goal isn't to have the reader think anything particular about any of the characters, just I want them to experience the character. But if, say, hypothetically, my goal were to have them like character A and dislike character B, I think if I did something to try to make that happen, it would backfire.
Yeah.
No one wants to be told what to think. So.
I also want to talk about place, because this book is called Morningside Heights, and it pretty much takes place in, I don't know, a 20-block radius. I mean, Arlo, we go back to his home, his various homes with his mother, but to me, New York is a city of neighborhoods, and this book sort of claims that belief. And was that always a conception that it would take place in this very circumscribed area? Was that something that you came to as you wrote?
No, I mean, that was always pretty central. I mean, the book's briefly in LA where Sarah's in medical school, and it's briefly in Portland where Sarah's at college. I mean, it does sort of make tentative journeys outside of a 20 block area, but you're right. The fundamental, there's a reason it's called Morningside Heights, and I do think of that neighborhood as a character in the story, in the novel, in a certain way. I guess the most simple answer is that I do tend to write about places I know, because I'm not that good at envisioning places that I haven't been, although I sometimes write about fictional places where I can make up the facts. But I actually think that more fundamentally, I was interested in a couple of things about writing about Morningside Heights. So I grew up in Morningside Heights. I know it really well. I lived the first 18 years of my life there, although I haven't lived there since, and I've lived outside of New York, and now I've been living in Brooklyn for the last 20 years. I probably know Morningside Heights as well as any neighborhood in the world. My mother still lives in the apartment I grew up in on Riverside Drive at 116th Street. My brother lives 5 blocks away at 111th Street. My wife teaches at Barnard. So I've got my fill of Morningside Heights. So it's a familiar neighborhood, but I'm also interested in a couple other things about it. So it's a weird combination of both big city and college town. And I'm interested in sort of hard, the idea of like writing about a famous Shakespeare professor, or like a famous law professor. In the case of my father, seems kind of like, what is it? A famous Shakespeare professor, famous law professor. But the whole there's something about college towns and about Morningside Heights. Where there's this weird kind of thing where my father in a 10-block radius was recognized on the streets. But you take him out of that 10-block radius, and no one knew who he was. So there's this kind of weird thing where someone who writes books that are read by 40 people is considered famous. I mean, Spence actually wrote books that were read by more than 40 people. But the whole sort of, I'm interested in writing about academia, and I teach, and so Morningside, I feel like it captures both the city, the big city, and that small college town. But also, I was interested in writing about the Upper West Side and the evolution or devolution of the Upper West Side. I grew up, I'm 57, I was born in 1964. I grew up in Morningside High. I grew up in the Upper West Side at a time when there was a meaningful distinction between the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side. Now, there's still a distinction, but it's more nuanced. And I grew up in the Upper West Side and went to school on the Upper East Side. I went to a small private Jewish school called Ramaz. And I was the academics kid. I was the poor kid among the rich kids. I was like the kid of the intellectual among the kids of the, upwardly mobile professionals. And I remember in 7th grade, a teacher, I don't know why he did this, but he had us go home and count all the books in.
Oh my God.
So my friends all had, TVs in every room of their house, of their apartments. Whereas we had one small black and white TV that was hidden in the closet and brought out reluctantly for certain PBS specials. But when we had to go home and count the books, I had more books than the rest of the class combined. And I was in 7th grade, I was 13 years old. I think I was both proud and embarrassed, but I kind of wanted to capture, when I was a kid, my East Side friends, their parents didn't want their kids to come to the West Side because the West Side was dangerous. So I wanted to capture kind of the old Upper West Side, but also the way the Upper West Side has changed. And I think that, because as you say, Marisa, the book is about loss and loss of identity. And I think, the Upper West Side still has an identity, but there's been a real loss in some of the establishments that have disappeared.
Yes.
So I think the neighborhood is
chock full of nuts that you read about is no longer there at the end of the story.
Pardon me?
The chock full of nuts that you read about is no longer there.
Chock full of nuts is no longer there. And even Ollie's, which replaced chock full of nuts, there was a fire and Ollie's is no longer there. Now it's a Shake Shack. Mm-hmm. So, at the very end of the book, Pru's walking uptown and walking past all the establishments she's known for the last 35 years. And some are still there, but many are gone.
Which is another way the book manages to suggest this sort of sweep of time, I think. I want to get to some questions. We have some questions here. From an anonymous attendee, how do you tackle revision? How different is the published book from your initial drafts? Well, it's not 3,000 pages, that much we know.
3,000 pages. I think every writer is good at certain things and bad at certain things. And then we sort of try to play to our strengths and overcome our weaknesses. I am a good reviser. And what I mean by that is I'm temperamentally a good reviser. I'm always telling my students this, that I think big changes at the roots of the tree are much more helpful than lots of small changes at the branches and leaves of the tree. And so, I'll sometimes say to my grad students, have you ever thought of doing this? And it's usually that this is something like a big change, a fundamental assumption. And usually the answer is no. And sometimes the answer is I can't do that because that would so deeply change my vision of the book. And that seems fine. But sometimes the answer should be, no, I hadn't thought about that. That will change my vision of the book, but maybe it'll help me make the book better and make the book be the book it wants to be. And so I think I'm pretty good at being I won't do anything, but I'm open to anything. I'm open to considering doing anything. And all that's my way of saying is that for me, revision is so, so deep that even beyond what you say, Marisa, which is obviously true, as the book is not 3,000 pages, there's just so many changes. For those of you who have read The World Without You, just briefly, that's a book It's a family reunion, the occasion for which is the death of the memorial for the death of his son, who was a journalist killed in Iraq. And the parents are splitting up because of that death at the beginning of the book. It wasn't until really late in the writing process that the parents were splitting up. That was a suggestion that was made to me by one of my trusted readers. I thought about it and he thought I needed to do that, and he convinced me. I think anyone who's read that book could not imagine that book without the parents splitting up. Yet that happened well, many years into the writing process. So all that's my long-winded way of saying is that revision is really revision, seeing something afresh, totally starting over. And then certainly on the line level, I mean, I love just cutting. I mean, I don't like first draft. I don't like fifth draft. I like 100th draft. So I see the first 6 years as kind of the down payment of being able to spend the last 2 years playing around with sentences. So
Was that how long it took for you to write this? 8 years?
7, 8 years. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to count exactly. Yeah, 7, 8 years. Yeah. I wish it took
I
me
have,
that time.
I have a question as a kind of ancillary to that. Which of the characters was the hardest for you to sort of pin to the page?
Well, I would say that Arlo in some ways was really easy to pin to the page, but as I said before, his appearances and disappearances he was structurally hard to pin to the page. I guess I would say 2 characters were hardest to pin to the page. One is Sarah, because, she's obviously really important. She's their daughter, but she's away in LA, and she kind of does what's expected. Whereas Arlo is easier to write. I mean, nothing's easy, as you know, just everything's hard. But I mean, Arlo kind of steals her thunder in some sort of way. So I think, I had to find a way to make her important, but allow Arlo to eclipse her in some ways. And then maybe even more so, I feel like Spence's sister, Enid, is a really important character that was hard to pin to the page, in part because she takes up so anyhow, just to tell the readers, the people on Zoom. So Spence had an older sister who was always kind of in trouble. He was always the golden child. But she got into a car accident when she was a teenager, and she was brain damaged, and she's kind of lived in an institution for most of her life. And she was really important to me because I think she, in the same way, Marisa, that you said that like Arlo cast a new light on Spence, I think in her own small way, Enid also cast a new light on Spence, because we're able to see it in his protectiveness of her. We're able to see a core vulnerability and get a window into his childhood that we wouldn't be able to get otherwise. But she's really not there very much at all. So she occupies very little real estate. So I needed to paint her in few brushstrokes. And also because she's brain damaged, I didn't want her to be an object of pity or any number of things I didn't want her to be an object of. Michael Cunningham talks about how you have to think of your most minor character in your novel as a major character in another novel who's making a cameo appearance in your novel. And that's kind of how I feel about Enid, is I think she's a major character in another novel making a cameo appearance in this novel. And so I have to really work hard to make those brushstrokes be evocative.
I love that idea. That's great. Here's another question. Can you talk about how you determined the point of view and narrative voice for this novel? Was that process different from your other novels?
Yeah. Well, definitely, I mean, my first novel, Swing Across the Hudson, was first person, whereas my subsequent 3 novels were third person. So, but both The World Without You, I mean, there's some moving in point of view in Matrimony, but both The World Without You and Morningside Heights are books where you really move point of view a lot. And I guess that kind of comes naturally to me. I'm not sure why. And in terms of the voice, I don't know, the voice you just hear. I'm not saying that it comes to you whole cloth, but a voice is something you don't plan out, or I don't plan out. It's just, you do it and you get it wrong, but then you bark up a lot of wrong trees and you get to the right tree. The voice felt natural to me, and it felt like a voice that could accommodate multiple points of view. I mean, it's not a deeply omniscient voice, because it's very close. It's more like a toggling. Starting to talk writing technicalities. It's more like a toggling third person than it is omniscient. There are moments of omniscience, but it's pretty close to whichever character whose head we're in. We're just moving around from character to character.
I have a question. What was surprising to you in this process? I mean, is there something that surprised you in terms of what you discovered in the story that you didn't know, or in your own practice as a writer that you hadn't known about yourself before?
Yeah, there was. So I definitely discovered something about structure in terms of Arlo, like I said before, but I actually, in a very different kind of way, discovered something about myself or the characters. So one of the biggest struggles for me, and part of the reason the book took so long to write, in addition to that structural issue that structural nut that I was struggling to crack for so long with Arlo, was, I don't want to give away too much, but so at some point later in the book, Prue meets a man, Walter, whom she embarks on a relationship with. And Walter was there all along, but I never, as my early readers would tell you, they thought there was no tension with Walter in those early drafts because I wasn't really willing to embrace the romantic possibilities between Prue and Walter. And the reason for that was because I was worried about my mother. So my mother was extremely loyal to my father and remains to this day, almost 11 years after his death, extremely loyal to him. And I was afraid to write a character who's not my mother and a character who's not my father, but both of whom bear more than a passing resemblance to my mother and father respectively. I couldn't get myself to embrace that relationship. And at some point I felt like I just had to make the book work. I actually spoke to my mother about this. She was fine with it. She's actually very good. She's a good reader and she's a sophisticated reader. I needn't have worried, but I was worried. I felt like it was a betrayal of their marriage in some way on the part of their son. And then embracing it and actually writing Walter, I kind of discovered that my fundamental assumption was kind of wrong. To start off with, like one of the things that strike me about the book, now having written it, is that Prue remains really loyal to Spence, and maybe she's even more loyal to Spence after whatever happens with Walter happens. And so I just was really looking at it, I would say the wrong way, or at least in too stark a way. That I assumed that if I were to embrace a relationship between Prue and Walter, that I would be in some way demeaning Prue's relationship with Spence. And then I found out that quite the opposite was true. So that was something I discovered about the characters, but I think I was discovering something about me and about my feelings about my parents in the process.
I mean, that is one of the great satisfying surprises of the book, is the way in which her relationship to Spence deepens as a result of so many of these tragic things that happened for her. I one more question. Who are the authors you enjoy reading? What do you read when you are deep in the middle of writing a book?
Well, I mean, I do have to say, I read Marisa Silver,
well,
for sure. I'm not just saying that. I mean, whatever. I'm not gonna embarrass you. I mean, you have to read Marisa's most recent book. It's amazing. But I mean, I'm a story guy, and I got to say, I teach Temporary, which is a story Marisa wrote, and every year it's among my students' favorites. But if we're allowed to move beyond,
yes, you can. I allow you to do that. Thank you.
I hate to choose among writers, but I love Elizabeth Strout. I think Olive Kittredge is a great book. What are some books I've read recently? I'm reading Peter Ho Davies's new novel called The Lie. It's called something like A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself. It's kind of like the male version of Jenny Offel's Department of Speculation. It's obviously autofiction, a short book about fatherhood and about making art. I think it's a really beautiful book. What else have I'd rather say books I've read recently that it's posted like favorites. What else have I read recently that I've really liked? Not so recent, but I think Aleph Bodeman's The Idiot is a really, really very compelling novel.
When you're writing, do you find yourself reading books that are similar in story to what you're doing, or what do you read while you write? That's the second part of the question.
I have certain things that I have to read, for my job, or if I'm blurbing a book or things like that. But I try to read what I want to read, irrespective of what there's some exceptions. I'm now working on a book that has a speculative element that's, unusual for me. And I mentioned talking to you about Europe, so and so I read a bunch of speculative books for that. But in general, I just read what I want to read and hope that I don't read differently for my writing than I do for, my non-writing. But like I recently read, I try to read it collectively. I just read Christine Smallwood's first novel called The Life of the Mind, which is a deeply internal book and very, very voicey, different from my work. I think there's definitely a voice in my work, but my work is quiet,
Mm-hmm.
understated. Whereas, there's a there's a real voice. I love voicing. I love Laurie Moore's work. So, I do like to read as eclectically as possible. I also like to discover a book. I like to read not what everyone's reading. That's what's great about independent bookstores like Politics and Prose, is that, you go into Politics and Prose and the booksellers know you and they say, hey, Josh, I think you've never heard this book, but I think you'd love this book. And, they're not always right, but they might be right. And they know, and I love a discovery, because nothing frustrates me more than to discover a book that people don't know about and to love it and feel like, why don't more people know about it? Why is everyone reading the same 10 books? So that kind of diversity of reading stuff is what I love about independent bookstores and what I like to read myself. So.
Well, we are almost out of time, but I just want to end by saying this, which is that I had the pleasure of reading this book before the pandemic was at its full height last summer when Josh was going to publish it. And then again, at this moment in our pandemic journey where things seem to be opening up. And I have to say that I had a really powerfully different experience of it, because I think we have all endured so much in this last year, and we have all grappled with so many of the issues that are going on in this book for this family, but none more so than endurance on very many different levels. And I think I really urge you guys to read this book. It is a beautiful, sumptuous story about endurance.
Thank you, Marisa. It was really both a pleasure and an honor. It's just fun to talk to you. But just a pleasure and honor to share the screen.
Thank you.
With a writer like you. So thank you. Thank you for reading it so carefully and generously.
You're welcome.
Keith and Mazan, thank you so much for spearheading this event. I really, really appreciate it. And, I want to urge everyone, obviously I want them to buy my book, but to be on that, to buy books from Politics and Prose, to buy books from your independent booksellers. They are what's keeping literature alive. And, support your local booksellers is really, really important.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Josh and Marisa, on behalf of Politics and Prose. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight, and be well and stay well read.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.